Not that long ago, I made a short series of videos looking at various racing and driving games for the Commodore 64. Producing that series gave me a chance to look at games which were both new to me, along with some I'd not played in quite some time. I loved working on that series and had been thinking of doing it all again on another machine. The only question being, which machine, of course. Of the options, what made the most sense for this follow-up? The humble Mega Drive. With a library which is far more than just home conversions of Sega's arcade hits, it makes for a great opportunity for me to learn about some new games and get some more driving games under the belt. Before diving in though, a few points which need to be noted. Firstly, this video is only going to focus on games for the base hardware. I don't have access to a 32X or Mega CD, and the size of the libraries for those make the high costs in obtaining them not really worth it to me at the present time. Secondly, the focus is on games where racing is the primary focus, whether that's on a course or a point-to-point run. Games which include driving sequences, but where they're not the focus, will not be part of this video. Finally, when it comes to a series of games, I'll probably only focus on one game in the series, unless there are installments which are really varied enough to make them worth checking out in more detail. Even with all of those, there is a large enough collection of titles here that really it's best for me to just drop the green flag and get this all going. This is Beyond The Scanlines, a series focusing on interesting games on classic computing and gaming platforms. Logically, the best place to start is with conversions of arcade hits. If anything, the Mega Drive has a reputation for them, and driving games are no exception to that rule at all. The first one we're looking at is Sega's Ode port of Super Hang-On, released in 1989. Being one of the first racing games which saw a release, does show the types of challenges early games got in this situation. Like with the frame rate. If you've spent time with any racing game which came later on, this one is certainly going to feel quite a bit rougher in comparison. It also marks one important distinction we'll see with many of Sega's ports to the console, where you don't just get a conversion of the arcade game, but also get a secondary mode added, which greatly expands the mechanics. Arcade mode is of course the default, where your goal is to get to the end of one of 4 courses, avoiding your rivals and the hazards to beat the clock and not run out of time. Each course increases in difficulty, both by the number of stages which have to be beaten, but also the challenges within them. Learning how best to race them and when to use and stop using your bike's turbo is quite the challenge. When you've had your fill of arcade mode, you could try out original mode. Here, you'll be racing rivals on shorter tracks. The challenge is getting to the end ahead of them, so you could use the sponsorship money earned between races to upgrade your bike, or more likely, to repair any damage caused in the previous race. Which is where things start to get challenging, particularly in the early game. Your bike is woefully underpowered and rather unresponsive to start with, which increases the challenge from the game's sluggishness that bit more. If you're not ready for it, you will crash, repeatedly in fact, leading to you being unable to even start a race if you can't repair all that damage. A fact made annoying because the game doesn't explicitly end when you get into this position. Original mode makes for a great concept, but can feel quite punishing for what is meant to be a fast, frantic arcade racer. Thankfully though, even with the slower pace of this conversion, arcade mode plays just as well as the original machine, making for a solid conversion to check out. The graphics are quite up there, though they don't scale as smoothly, and the soundtrack is pretty much on par considering how close the hardware is. It's a very early release that really is one worth checking out. Another home conversion of a Sega hit next, and this time it's Outrun, coming out in 1991. Unlike Super Hang-On, this could be considered a no-frills version of the game, with no original mode included, instead just focusing on that arcade game and its mechanics and bringing them home incredibly well. Putting you behind the wheel of a very fancy sports car, it's all about that scenic drive, working your way to each checkpoint before running out of time. The challenge comes from avoiding other traffic, who will serve to slow you down should you make contact, along with negotiating the courses without sliding into the scenery, costing you precious time when you crash. As you approach the end of each stage, you'll have a chance to pick which route to take next. It makes for a simple mechanic, but this well and truly defines the game. Though for some, stages may seem a little out of order, as they're based on an earlier revision of the arcade game rather than the version most of us know and love. The branching routes offer plenty of replay value, between enjoying the colourful scenery on offer and trying out various combinations to see all 15 stages that you can drive to. The most important factors are all here, of course. Though the speed may not be up there with the arcade cabinet, it is fast and smooth enough to be enjoyable. This is also helped with the controls, which are just as responsive and intuitive as you'd expect. Finally, of course, is the music, with the trio of tunes from the arcade brought over intact, again due to the closeness of hardware, along with a bonus track available. It might be more focused than other Sega racing game home ports, but honestly, I'm more than okay with that. I'd rather have a home version which offers fast and fun driving, than a version which does an alright job, and dilutes it by trying to add a secondary mode that shoots high and doesn't quite make the mark. The final game which Sega would bring home that we're looking at is, of course, Virtua Racing, released in 1994. Its big standout feature is the use of Sega's Sega Virtua processor chip on the cart, which was notorious for pushing the price up at release, which contributed it to doing very badly in retail at the time. Now, if you divorce it from that context and sit down to play with it with an open mind, you'll find it's quite a solid conversion, honestly. Sure, the level of detail and the game's frame rate are never going to match what the Model 1 arcade board could put out. But does that really matter if the mechanics are brought over intact? And for me, not at all. Virtua Racing has you racing Formula 1 cars over a series of 3 courses, each being named for their difficulty, and the tougher ones offer tighter corners, trickier tracks, and are generally harder to negotiate, along with increasingly tighter time limits. As you'll be battling the clock, it's paramount to avoid mistakes if you want a chance at finishing a race before you run out of time and get the proverbial game over. The polygonal 3D visuals offer a few wow factors, but the biggest has got to be freely switching between one of 4 camera angles at any point during the race. It was jaw-droppingly incredible on first release of the arcade game, and it still manages to do so here on the Mega Drive. The controls are solid and responsive, though do require a 6-button controller in order to access all those view options. Handling is tight and responsive, doing the best which can be done when translating an analog steering wheel and pedal setup onto the humble gamepad. At the crux of it, Virtua Racing more than lives up to what the arcade model suggests, in that it won't keep you engrossed for a long period of time, but it's impressive to fire up for a spin every once in a while. Not only because it offers a look into an alternate history, but also because it's still such a fast, thrilling racer, even today. Sticking with the 3D theme, we're now looking at the port of Hard Drivin', converted by Sterling Silver Software and published by Tengen in 1990. Unlike Virtua Racing, which relied upon the SVP chip to provide extra hardware capability to handle those 3D visuals, Hard Drivin' does it all on a stock Mega Drive console. Now once again, it's never going to live up to what the custom hardware of the arcade machine offers. But you know something? Once again, there is a decent enough frame rate for it to be playable, which is also helped by how the controls simulate the analog steering offered by the arcade cabinet. Billed as the first true arcade driving simulation, Hard driving puts you behind the wheel of a racing car on a course offering two layouts. The speed track, which is about putting the pedal to the metal and racing around as fast as possible. Or the stunt track, which is about careful speed management as you negotiate jumps, banked corners, and the most dangerous hazard of all, the loop. The ultimate challenge here is to beat the game's par time. On doing so, once you run out of time and end the game, you'll get a chance to race a lap against the current record holder. This is a single lap run in which you really need to drive as hard as possible in order to beat their ghost time. If you succeed, your time now becomes the new ghost time, which others will have to beat. Though its follow-up, Race Driving, offers more course options, I feel they're not tuned anywhere near as well as this original course is. It's certainly worth trying out, as its super stunt track could be quite fearsome when you feel you've mastered what is on offer with the course of this game. But that's really where the joy of hard driving is for me. Getting to grips with how your car handles and using that knowledge to master both the speed and stunt layouts with consistent, tight laps. Once again, this is not one you want to play continuously, but come back to every so often to see if you can best your times, which makes it a great way to challenge yourself. We have another conversion from the Tengen Atari game stable with Road Blasters, once again converted by Sterling Silver Software, but published in 1991. Now, I'll admit this one is probably a borderline pick. Road Blasters is a racing game where your goal is to get to the end of each stage without running out of fuel. Passing the mid-stage checkpoint will replenish some of it, but it's really about collecting the orbs, green ones sitting on the road, or red ones released by destroying enemy cars, which will go a long way to helping out as well. Even more so as you get further and further into the game. Your score is most important, however, and the best way to build it up is by increasing your multiplier. You'll do this by shooting enemy cars. Each one you take out increases it. Miss one though, and it'll drop. So keeping it up is about learning to be easy on the trigger finger, and only going for shots if you know you've lined them up correctly. Admittedly, this can be hard to resist, as when you reach the end of a stage, the number of enemies you've destroyed earns a bonus, and that fills up your reserve fuel tank. Which for me makes it quite a risk-reward kind of setup, and that's a really neat aspect of the game. There is one big change over the original arcade machine though, and it works wonders here, having the idea of lives. If you run out of fuel, you've got 5 lives which allow you to restart on the current stage, as it's not just a full continue resetting your score and effectively starting again, you can continue without starting a new play right from the start of the stage you got to. What makes this one a neat package is the presentation is pretty much up there with the arcade machine, especially with aspects like the overall performance and smoothness of the frame rate, but also the feeling you get from the music. Once it kicks in as you start closing in on the last part of a stage, it's certainly a euphoric kind of feeling, especially after tackling a tough stage with your car's fuel supply being nothing more than fumes as you cross the finish line. Moving away from 3D races and onto the first overhead conversion, we've got Leyland's Super Off-Road, converted by Software Creations and published by Accolade on their Ballistic label in 1994. The first thing about this conversion is right there in the title, dropping the Ivan Iron Man Stewart license, which had most likely expired by this point. Admittedly, doesn't really hurt the game that much, and in fact, helps things out in quite a few ways, such as the order the tracks are raced in, where the arcade machine and most other home versions introduced new courses once prior ones had been played forwards, and in reverse, here they're played through in sequence. Said sequence does differ from these versions, but I kinda dig it because you're more likely to see some of the other courses on offer, which is less likely based on how things are raced in the other versions. Other tweaks include how you qualify for the next race. Instead of needing to beat all the AI drivers to qualify, now you just need to place in the top 3 to move on. This alone makes this version my go-to, if only for the challenge increasing at a gentler pace, instead of demanding perfection right from the start. That's not all though. As to compensate, you no longer start with any nitros. This puts you at a slight disadvantage to the AI, who continue to have and use them, so that advantage gained by the relaxed qualifying rules isn't as large as you might have first thought. The racing is straightforward. Race 4 laps over each course and aim to finish in the top 3 to qualify. Whatever place you finish in, you'll earn prize money, which could be also collected during the race, along with nitros. Now, one of the more unique elements here are the courses. Being an off-road racing game, you'll find there's plenty of bumps, jumps, water pits, and more which you'll need to negotiate. And keeping your truck on course and moving quickly can be quite a challenge because of all the physics involved. At least until you install some upgrades, which can be done using your prize money at the Between Race shop. The original game was fun, but a tad too challenging at points, and so the adjustments made here go a long way to making it far more enjoyable, at least in my eyes. And of course, bringing a friend along for the ride just makes it even more fun as a result. The final arcade conversion I want to showcase is one which actually didn't see release. Danny Sullivan's Indie Heat is the follow-up to Super Off-Road, once again being developed by Software Creations and was set to be published by Tradewest in 1993. This is one of those games which ended up being cancelled fairly late in development, and as it shows with this prototype, which eventually managed to find its way to the internet. Mechanically, as the follow-up to Super Off-Road, it shares a lot in common. You'll be racing IndyCars through the championship a course at a time. These courses are recreations of both ovals and road courses which the real cars race on, and so there is a lot of visual detail around them, making everything look quite nice as a result. The races here are fast, and also run longer thanks to the varying number of laps required to complete them, which also plays into the big new mechanic on offer: pit stops and your fuel supply. As the race goes on, you'll be using up your fuel and it will eventually get to a critical point where you'll need to pit stop in order to refill it. The pit stops though are where the tactics really come into play here. And not only do you want to make sure you don't stop too often, but if you're a little crafty, you can knock a rival out of their stall, slowing them down because once they run out of gas, they've got to crawl back to the pits to do it again. It's got to be said, this is a much tougher game than its predecessor, and not only because qualifying for the next round requires you to beat all the AI rivals, and it's worse because they're faster than you off the bat, and they don't tend to pit as much as you need to. Once again, between races you'll have the opportunity to use your prize winnings to upgrade the car, whether it's tweaking the performance, increasing its fuel economy, or making your pit crew do their thing much faster. There are far more options on offer, which means prioritising the right upgrades is now important to help you win more races. It's a bit of a shame that this one wasn't actually released. The presentation, visuals, audio and controls are all well done and feel great. What's just missing is that final tuning pass to make it fairer, which makes it one worth trying at least as a curiosity, but not quite as an essential play to put into your game's library. Leaving the arcade behind, and it's time for some racing games which originated on other machines before being ported over to the Mega Drive. The first one we're looking at is Championship Pro-Am, Rare's reworking of their 1987 NES game RC Pro-Am, published in 1992 by Tradewest. The goal is to race your remote-controlled vehicle over a series of races. Moving on to the next requires you to finish in the top 3. And finishing outside will cost you one of your continues. The racing itself is quite straightforward here, which should be no surprise considering its 8-bit origins. You'll take on the track from an isometric style view and need to race a variable number of laps. As you drive, you'll need to keep an eye out for the pickups placed on the track. These range from upgrades to your car's stats, either in top speed, handling or acceleration. There are ones which provide temporary invulnerability, which are the only power-ups which can be picked up by the rival cars. You'll also find icons which spell out champion, and once completed will upgrade you to a new vehicle. The computer drivers will also be upgraded should you do this, so no, you're suddenly not going to have a massive advantage compared to them for the next race. Of course, there are also weapons, forward-firing missiles or mines which are dropped behind you, which can disable a rival temporarily. With all of these options available, the racing can certainly be quite frantic. Especially as Championship Prime upgrades the fields to 6 cars on the track over the 4 of the original game. It delivers on that old school feeling where the circumstances can change rapidly, which might not be what more simulation focused players want, but for those looking for arcade style thrills, it honestly hits the spot, doing a great job of bringing them back. Some might have written this one off as being dated on its original release, but I have to admit, I think it's great seeing this style of racing appear on the 16-bit generation. From consoles to micros, now we've got Lotus Turbo Challenge, the adaptation of Magnetic Fields' Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, released on the Amiga and Atari ST, converted by Gremlin and published by EA in 1992. Now this is one I've previously covered in detail with its own episode of the show, so if your interest is piqued, do check that one out. There'll be a card or something in the description. Playing either solo or with a friend, you'll be racing over a series of 8 courses. Each is themed in various ways around their environments, whether driving through a forest, on highways at night, or in a snowfield. Each is broken up into multiple sections, and so completing them is really about getting through each one before running out of time. The amount of obstacles on screen is quite impressive, and though this conversion might not live up to that Amiga original, you'll find it's quite a great take on arcade racing, especially if you can bring a friend along for the ride in order to challenge you for the top score. Even better is that each course has its own password, so if you want to start a session at a particular favourite, once you've gotten its password, it's pretty easy to do it right from the main menu. If you're a fan of arcade-style racing games and want to see a darn good European take on the genre, this one is certainly worth taking the time to check out, with plenty of challenge in mastering each of the courses, no doubt helped by those ever so tight time limits you need to beat. Of all the games I'm planning to showcase in this video, the one style of racing which didn't get much of a look in is rallying. Though not anymore with Rage Software's Power Drive, published by US Gold in 1995, a year after its original Amiga and PC release. Power Drive is about working your way through a series of rally events, getting to the end of each stage within the allocated qualifying time. These stages can be point-to-point special stages, or rallycross events where you've got to beat another driver. You'll also be challenged with skill tests, stages which have you perform a series of tight maneuvers before making it to the finish line. Careful driving is required here, as prior to each stage you'll need to make sure you have enough money to pay the entry fee, along with repairing any damage you've accumulated. Later on, you'll get the chance to buy new cars, giving you more performance during those later events. When getting started, one of the big challenges is getting used to how these rally beasts handle. It's far less precise than in other racing games, and so the unwary player is likely to end up bouncing off the sides of the course, wasting both your time and incurring damage in the process. Despite that, it's one which feels quite fresh and is very challenging, as you don't really get the same type of rally experience from other games of the era. They tend to be much tighter to control, and makes it feel a little more technical in comparison to the looser driving offered by Power Drive. If there was something I didn't really like, it's the music. The tracks you hear whilst racing get repetitive in no real short order, and it's enough to take a bit of the mood out of the racing as a result. It's one of those cases where, had the music been better, I think the problem wouldn't really be there. It's not something worth writing the game off over though, but if you're up for some rallying, you'll have a grand time indeed with Power Drive. Whilst plenty of racing games are meant as a solo challenge or even played head-to-head with a friend, Super Skid Marks, the port of Acid Software's Amiga classic, published by Codemasters in 1995, certainly goes a bit further with its 4-player split-screen support. Though compared to many of the other games showcased in this video, the racing offered doesn't really offer any thrills or fanciness. It's you, your friends, and a variety of tracks on offer. The first mode you can play is the Championship. Here you'll pick one out of a series of leagues to start with and need to beat all 6 tracks. Once you master those, there are even more leagues which become unlocked, making for a lot of racing to do when all is said and done. The racing itself is quite loose as you'll be slipping and sliding all over the place as you learn the tracks. In fact, with the overall pace of the game, it can take some playtime to get used to how these cars handle and get comfortable with when to turn in without bouncing into the wall on each corner. Moving to the next race in a league requires you to place within the top 3. If you don't, the game will let you try each race 3 times before ending your run. I quite dig this, as it means you've got a chance to practice those courses when first reaching them, and it means you don't need to replay earlier ones to get there when you mess up on your first or any other run. Something I find distinctive is the visual style, where most games of the time had sprite graphics which were hand-drawn or rendered out from high-detail 3D models. Those in Super Skid Marks are rendered from low-detail ones instead, resulting in quite a different visual aesthetic to the cars. Though its racing doesn't really offer a lot of fancy thrills, once again, thanks to being built around Codemasters' J-Kart cartridge, if you can get some friends around in a reasonably distanced manner, you can all go to town with frantic off-road action presented in split screen. 4 players is really something not to laugh at. Next up we have The Duel, Test Drive 2, Distinctive Software's 1992 reworking of their 1989 game, published by Accolade on their Ballistic label. This reworking extends the original game, which featured 1 course and 2 cars, the Ferrari F40 and the Porsche 959. There's now an additional 2 courses available along with a new car, the Lamborghini Diablo. Your goal is to race to the end of each segment without crashing your car enough times to run out of lives. You can challenge either the clock to beat your best time on each, or a computer rival, who can be set to take any of the cars on offer. Racing tends to be a little more realistic here, particularly on the higher difficulty levels, which involve changing gears as well. Going too fast when cornering can set you skidding, and you will need to avoid traffic. Again, that which you're approaching from behind, as well as oncoming traffic as well. Then you get the police. Your car is fitted with a radar detector, and if you're speeding by when you reach a cop, they will be in pursuit aiming to get in front and force you to a stop, which earns you a time penalty. As you reach the end of each section, you'll need to pull into a gas station to end, offering a nice secondary challenge because if you fail to do so, you will lose another life from running out of fuel. After that, you'll get a progress screen which shows how you and your rival are doing, along with the penalties you incurred in this section and what the overall standings of the race are, before continuing on to start the next segment. All up, this is quite a solid port of a classic, offering a great sense of speed as you weave through traffic, and the stages can actually get quite challenging at times, particularly when dealing with tight corners around cliffs. And of course, the presentation here makes this a fine translation and enhancement to a great release to top it all off. Gremlins Top Gear 2, published by Vic Tokai in 1994, can be best thought of as an alternate take on the Lotus series, specifically the original Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge with its circuit racing. Though there's plenty of upgrades on offer to expand things for a console audience, as the Top Gear series originated on the SNES. The big upgrade here is the racing. Lotus played things more straight and more traditional, but you'll find in Top Gear things can get far more wild. There are trickier hazards to negotiate as you get further into the game, and you'll also find pickups to collect during the race. Additional cash is always handy, but there's also extra nitros and temporary speed boosts. The addition of nitros really mixes the racing up. saving those for those moments where the speed boost could push you ahead of a rival or two is quite a tactical thing which you have to factor in. The art style is quite a step up as well, as not only do you get a good number of objects acting as trackside scenery, but you'll find yourself racing in a variety of weather conditions, and times of day as well. Needing to be extra careful as you race late at night with the restricted visibility can make weaving through the pack that bit more challenging. Of course, between races, you'll use your prize winnings and collected money pickups to upgrade your car. As you'd expect, these are essential to helping give you that extra performance against your rivals. One thing which stands out here is the structure of the races. You'll visit a particular region and run through a 4-course championship of sorts, splitting things up nicely, which is helped by the passwords you're given as you complete each one. With 64 races all up, working your way through this championship can take some time, so being able to come back and resume really gives a burgeoning driver a shot at completing the lot. Then of course you've got 2-player support. Bringing your friend across, you can go head to head and see who can take that championship out, offering some thrilling racing indeed. Which makes Top Gear 2 another great addition to check out, especially if you do have a friend handy to play it with. We've seen conversions of games from the arcade, and also conversions from home computers or other console systems. But now, it's time to look at some games which were exclusive to the Mega Drive or released there first. The original Micro Machines found plenty of popularity over a variety of platforms, but it's a whole other story with its sequel, which debuted on the Mega Drive before being ported elsewhere. Micro Machines 2 Turbo Tournament was developed by Supersonic Software and published by Codemasters in 1994. Once again, it's all about racing tiny vehicles over a variety of household environments. Whether it's dump trucks over the dinner table, ATVs in the garden, there are plenty of wacky combinations to experience over the many courses you'll race over. For the solo player, there's 2 modes available. The Challenge mode returns from the first game, in which you'll work your way through the many courses on offer. It's about placing in the top 2 at the end of each race in order to proceed to the next. Otherwise, you'll lose a life and need to replay the current stage. The variety in courses is what makes this one so engaging, as every new race brings a new vehicle and course combination which shows off how many of these little toy cars are featured in the game. The second mode is the Super League. Here, you'll start out in the lowest division and need to work your way up to the top. You'll run through 4 races, scoring more points the better you do. If you get to the top spot at the end, you'll move up to the next class, which features harder courses and faster vehicles. If you wind up the bottom, you'll be relegated to the one below. Then, there's the options for multiple players. Micro Machines 2 is one of the few Codemasters games to ship on their J-Kart cartridges, including 2 additional game ports, allowing up to 4 players to join in. But that's the beginning of the multiplayer fun, as it also offers a party mode, one in which players can share controllers. Though it sounded like a fine idea long ago, I'm not sure it's one which will go down all that well in these modern, socially distanced times. But 8 players playing at once would have to be seen to be believed, and it goes down nicely with options to run a 16-player knockout tournament too. The variety of options here is really what makes Micro Machines 2 a great one to have in the collection, especially for those nights when you can bring a bunch of friends around to enjoy some old school racing fun. The other original release might be a stretch, but Outrun 2019 does stand as its own game. This 1993 release from Sega was developed by Sims and started out as its own thing before being reworked into an Outrun sequel fairly late in development. Set in what seems like the far-off future of 2019, the goal, as with the other games in the series, is to get to the end of each course without running out of time. The big difference is that instead of one course, you'll race through several smaller ones, each offering a mix of sequential and branching stages, making the journey through each a little less distinct than the original game. The futuristic environments make things feel distinct in many ways, from stages which feature roads high above the ground, to jumps and sections containing no road at all. The futuristic atmosphere is also helped by the various roadside objects you'll see, along with the horizon visuals. You'll be enjoying your share of blue skies as well, but there's also that sense of greyness in the visuals too. Something else which contributes is your car. It doesn't just look like it belongs in an alternate 21st century showroom, but drives like it as well. Not only because of how it tops out at a whopping 570 km per hour, but also because of its booster system. This operates in a very unique manner. You've got to get to your top speed first, and then hold it for some time whilst the booster charges. Once it does though, boom, you're off on a serious ride, which, if you're not ready for it, can be quite an easy way to be heading for an off-road journey, losing valuable time in the process. It might not offer the iconic vibes of the original game, but it is playable, fast and thrilling in many ways regardless. It's an interesting diversion from what Outrun is in many people's minds, and as a result it feels quite fresh to play and is certainly worth trying out. While most of the games I'm showing here are focused on pure racing, sometimes there are times when you just want to blow up some rivals while speeding around a course. The first of these games is Combat Cars, developed and released by Accolade in 1994. From the outset, you might think of this one as being rather generic. The title doesn't help much to change that opinion, and neither do the environments. But sometimes there can be plenty under the surface, which isn't visible on first glance. Rather than racing recreations of real circuits or fictional ones in the style of them, here you'll race ones set in a series of environments. These range from beaches to harbours, suburbs to snowfields, and getting increasingly more complex layouts as you progress through the game. It's the selectable characters which introduce some variety into the mix. When starting the game, you'll choose one out of a pack of 6. Each has their own performance characteristics for their cars, but also their own weapons. Whether it's a set of homing missiles, shotguns, or even glue traps, there is a variety of them on offer. As with many other games, it's about finishing each race in the top 3 to qualify for the next. This rewards you with prize money which you can spend to upgrade your car between races. Whether upgrading the handling, its performance, or the weapon stock, there are plenty of ways to make it more formidable when out on the track. The racing offers that rough and ready experience you'd expect of a lot of non-tarmac courses, so mastering the tricks necessary to take the tight corners is important, especially if you're using a driver who has one of the weaker weapons available. Something else which stands out is how clear the cars are when on the track. There are other games where the cars don't really stand out so well on different surfaces, but that is not the case here. Along with that, the controls are tight, and based on some of the layouts you'll negotiate, that is truly a critical thing that they're as good as they are. It makes for a solid challenge all up, especially if you choose a driver who has a less powerful weapon system available. It makes for some thrilling racing action as a result. Double Clutch, a 1993 release developed by BGS Development and ASCII Entertainment Software, is less about blasting your rivals and more about ramming them from the road. After selecting your driver, each of whom offers an advantage in a different area of performance, you then take to the track. Once again, there's an arcade-style progression scheme here, as you'll need to finish in the top 3 to qualify for that next race. Unlike some other games though, should you fail to reach it, it's game over, as there's no continues on offer. At least when playing solo. When playing with a friend, providing one of you places in the top 3, you can both continue to the next race. Between races, you have the opportunity to visit the upgrade shop to upgrade your car. As always, what's on offer is performance related, but you'll also be able to buy tools which can be used to repair any incurred damage. As yes, damage is a thing here, gained when you crash into obstacles or rival drivers. Normally when on the track, the racing is usually a clean affair. But sometimes you might need some clear track, and the right kind of nudge with a rival can push them off the track, into an obstacle, and ending their run. What's even better though is, this isn't just a player instigated thing, as the AI rivals can take each other out, with the sound of the explosion echoing as the field shrinks. The courses here are an interesting matter. You'll find you race each course forwards and in reverse before moving on to the next. It's great for learning those early ones, as you'll get plenty of time to get to grips with their layouts, but do be careful with the later ones, which introduce some very gnarly tricks and turns, which can be tough to master due to how little time you'll get to race on them. In a way, Double Clutch feels like the kind of game which would belong more on a system like the Amiga than on the Mega Drive. Factors like the track layouts, to the presentation and visuals, it feels quite a bit different than many of the other games I've showcased in the video thus far. But you know what? It's still quite a great deal of fun, even if you're playing solo. But if you can bring a friend on board as well, you can have an even better time challenging each other and going for the top place. Now onto what has probably got to be one of the biggest names I'm showcasing in this video, Blizzard's Rock 'n' Roll Racing, published by Interplay in 1994. Your goal is to work your way up to winning the Indianapolis Super Cup, the top league of the rock and roll racing circuit. When things start out, you'll first pick your driver and starting vehicle. Each driver offers their own set of bonuses to how their car performs, and each vehicle carries a unique set of weapons. So, picking both the driver and vehicle which suits your playstyle is very important. Then it's time to hit the track. Working your way up to take the Super Cup involves taking on a number of smaller leagues. These are made up of 8 individual races, so to move on to the next, you'll have to earn enough points to qualify. The total amount needed and what you've currently got is shown before each race. Though you can end a season early, moving on to the next one if you've earned enough points, it's not the wisest of moves, as you'll probably want to earn as much prize money as you can, because you'll certainly need it. This of course is earned by placing in each race. The better you do, the more cash you'll have to spend on upgrades. It might sound counterproductive, but saving up for a new car is more important, especially as you work towards those later leagues. The racing itself comes from an isometric view, and this might seem odd at first glance, but considering Rock 'n' Roll Racing is a sort of sequel to Interplay's RPM Racing on Super NES, and that itself was a follow-on to C64 Classic Racing Destruction set, it does make sense and feels quite apt. It's certainly a unique view setup, and one which offers a unique sense of height to the tracks, which is something you don't get in many racing games of this era. The weapons on your vehicle aren't just for show, as whilst they'll only disable rivals temporarily, using them at the right time is important in order to not just take, but also hold a lead position for the race. With both options for forward firing and rear firing weapons, there are plenty of tactical options available with how you'll use them during a race. The biggest contribution to the atmosphere, and the game's name of course, is the soundtrack. Featuring covers of a number of hard rock tracks, it certainly makes the racing feel far more intense than you would have expected otherwise. And so Rock 'n' Roll Racing is the kind of racing game that is quite action-packed, quite thrilling, and a great challenge. It's got a great 2-player mode as well, and it really gives you something a bit heavier than other racing games I've covered so far. After checking out some more fantastic styles of racing, it's time for a return to more traditional forms of motorsports, as there are still some more Formula 1 games worth checking out. first of them is Ayrton Senna's Super Monaco GP2. Produced with input from the man himself, as the introduction proclaims, this is a 1992 update to the 1990 port of Sega's arcade game. The main change this brings over from the first game is the removal of the arcade mode. In its place is the Senna GP, which lets you run a single race over one of 3 courses, including a recreation of a karting course designed by Senna himself. The main part of the game here is the World Championship, which runs over the course of a season. The goal here is to work your way through each course and score as many points as possible to be crowned the champion once it ends. Unlike the first game, there is a simplified beginner mode available which caps the races at 3 laps and removes many of its distinct features which make it stand out. With Master Mode, alongside the longer 5-lap races, you'll have a few additional bits to manage, namely rivalries. After qualifying on each course, you'll get a chance to challenge another driver in the next race, or one may challenge you instead. Your goal at this point is to finish ahead of them in the upcoming race. Beat your rival enough times, and you'll swap teams with them, gaining a vehicle upgrade. Despite the improvements everywhere else in the game, the racing itself hasn't improved that much from the first game, which is not a bad thing, though it does limit things somewhat, at least compared to some of the other games I'm showcasing in the video. I still love the rear view mirror setup, which makes it possible to be far more aggressive when blocking drivers coming up from behind. And of course, the overall pace is solid enough to enjoy as well, with the controls responding quickly and precisely to your inputs as well. The only downside is the kind of horrible acceleration your car has, which can be a tad too penalising when you do make a mistake, at least when playing with the automatic or 4-speed gearbox options. Ultimately though, mastering the 7-speed gearbox is truly essential to mastering the game here and getting the best speed out of your car. And it's got to be said, either this or its prequel are well worth your time checking out, but it's the little extra details which make this second game the better pick for me. Up next is F1, developed by Luncor and published by Domark in 1994. This one can be seen as an upgrade of sorts to 16-bit classic Vroom, now with the official FIA license, which means your rivals are now named after real drivers, rather than imaginary ones, as is the case with Vroom. As per the original game, 2 modes are on offer. The arcade mode has you race through courses in sequence, and your goal is to simply race a number of laps and overtake a set number of cars to qualify. Getting to the end with enough drivers overtaken will move you on to the next course, where you'll now need to overtake more in order to do the same. Otherwise, the game ends. Most of your time will be spent inside the championship mode. This has you racing through a season which you can customize to include as many of the game's tracks as you want. A great touch which allows you to have a session as short or as long as you prefer based on your time available. As with several other games we've showcased, the visuals on the road use a mixture of sprite work for vehicles, including your car's dashboard, and 3D objects for roadside obstacles. It makes for a neat setup, though some aspects are a bit fiddly, namely how close some obstacles are to the side of the road, meaning it's easy to crash and get distracted, where other games would be a little more lenient in that regard. Compared to other games, the racing offers a stronger sense of realism here, even if it's still a much faster paced game compared to those more dedicated simulations you might find on computers. It's also shown with the setup options you have prior to heading out onto the track. Enough options to give you a sense of customization, but not enough to be overwhelmed by having to tweak every little detail out of the car to truly maximise performance. On a technical front, the game is fast when in motion, even without the turbo mode, where it offers a solid sensation of speed. Controls are responsive, offering some weight in their handling, but it helps provide that light feeling of a simulation, which other games haven't really done so far. It results in a racer which offers that little more depth than your typical arcade one, and gives you an extra challenge to boot as well. Though followed up with F1 World Championship Edition, which gives you the freedom to select alternate teams, I kind of think the original game's simpler aesthetic look is much more pleasing to the eye, and it's just a bit more polished and tuned as a result. The other game is possibly worth checking out, but I didn't really spend enough time with it to really recommend it over this. But either way, you can't really go wrong. Onto a bit of an import journey now with F1 Circus MD, developed and released by Nichibutsu in 1991. The F1 Circus series saw release on a variety of platforms over in Japan, and though only released there, the language barrier isn't enough to make it unplayable for those of us who don't really know the language. That being said, there were plans for this to be localized for a US release, and while that sadly didn't pan out, there is an early version which is somewhat localized out there, should you want to try this out. When starting out, you've got options for racing on a single course or playing through the full season. Regardless of which you pick, your next choice is for which team you wish to drive for, a detail which many games miss, allowing you to live out those fantasies of racing as your favourite driver. As a slightly more serious game, you do have the chance to tweak your setup before taking to the track, and there are a lot of options here which can make working out your ideal setup a bit fiddly, which shouldn't really be a surprise, unless you've spent the time making setups for other racing sims. Things do take a step back as you take out to the road though. The overhead view can be a little restrictive because of the car sizes, and unlike other games, the tracks are designed to scroll vertically, similar to games like F1 Spirit, resulting in the course layouts not matching up 100% to the original course layouts. As for whether that's a letdown or not, it's ultimately dependent on your own preferences, but it can make things a little tougher if you're familiar with those courses from playing other games. Something else which might throw players off is the side radar display. I found myself using this quite a lot to get the general layout of a course and help get ready for when tighter corners came up, as I found the corner indicators which do appear on your HUD don't appear as early as I would have liked. The racing can get thrilling at points, and the purely vertical scrolling does help keep things flowing, despite the other challenges it might bring. If you don't mind the rougher text, or are able to find that localized prototype, it's one that's worth trying out at least, especially because it offers a style of racing which wasn't really seen often on 16-bit systems. The final Formula 1 game we're checking out is Vari's 1992 release, F1 Super License, the third and final of their tie-ins with Japanese driver Satoru Nakajima. This one returns to the overhead view which the first in their series, F1 Grand Prix, used, and is quite a bit more refined to make it a more playable experience as a result. Once again, you've got the option of starting out with running a single race or playing through the full championship. Prior to starting each race, you get an overview of the course from the man himself. Though of course this is all in Japanese, so you need to brush on that if you really want to get the most out of the game. Then you have options to tweak your car setup. And of all the games I've showcased in this video, the customization screen here is the most friendly for those who aren't simulator fans, with visual representations of how each change affects the car as you tweak the setup, so you can help dial it in and get what you really want to happen. Adding this feature was a minor detail all up, but it goes a long way in helping to understand the effects of what your changes do, and really helps in having you dial in the right setup for each track and each race. But now it's time to hit the track and start qualifying. Here you'll aim to get the best lap time possible over a 5-lap run. The game's overhead view is great, not only due to the smaller car sprites, which allow for more of the track to be seen, but also with the use of multi-directional scrolling, making it easier to follow the course. One neat feature is that you get an overtake burst at the start of each lap, which you can use at the right point for a momentary burst in speed. It feels just as you'd expect, and in its own way is a unique foreshadowing of things that we'd see in modern F1 racing today. The only real downside is when you get to the main race itself, and it's really around your rivals, as they pretty much ignore you and can drive straight through your points, which can be really annoying when you start in the middle of the grid. Nothing hurts more than getting a decent start, only to be knocked off course, spin out, and then find yourself chasing backmarkers thanks to an AI rival who couldn't get out of the way as they approached you and knocked you off course. It's the type of disappointment which, whilst not ruining the game, can really set you back in enjoying it thanks to these short races on offer. Being spun out early can make it hard to regain enough places, and it's something I found rather unfair because you're not really at the limits of your own performance, but set up for an unfair run thanks to the AI, which is ultimately a shame, as otherwise this one is a fun arcade-style racer which offers some great moves for accessibility for those who are less into the setup side of things. Considering the success of the Mega Drive in the USA, where it was released as the Genesis, you would expect to see more games which focused on the styles of racing which were big over there. But as it turns out, there weren't all that many released after all. The first of them is ESPN Speed World, developed by Park Place Productions and published by Sony ImageSoft in 1994. This one is all about the thrills of stock car racing. Being licensed by ESPN means the tracks aren't officially licensed, though many of them are included and named after the state they're situated in rather than by their full name. There are 15 all up, split between short ovals, super speedways and road courses. You can race them standalone as a single race or race through them in the championship mode altogether. Before taking to the track, you'll have the chance to set the car up, tweaking your gear ratios, tyres, the spoiler angles and more. Learning how each of these settings impacts your performance is very handy, so that you can set things up and get the best performance when on the track. Once you've done that, it's time to start a qualifying session before taking on the race itself. When in motion, the game is quite attractive with some nice sprite work on the cars along with the horizon visuals. A game is more than just its looks though, as while it offers some neat mechanics like drafting your rivals for extra speed, they're not really implemented all that well. The drafting has a lack of precision, meaning it's hard to balance yourself so that you can slingshot by your rival at that right moment to take position. Along with that, your rivals can be seriously aggressive at times. It's as if they're not quite aware of your presence and are happy to knock you out of the way to take the line when you least expect it. It's certainly something which could ruin your race if you're not really in a position to claw your way back up, which, depending on the circuit, might be tougher than you'd think. It's quite a shameful result that this one suffers so much in the playability department, especially when it really has some nice options like adjusting the race length, which brings pit stops and pit strategy into play, which is quite an important element with stock car racing. Overall, ESPN Speed World is more seen as a curiosity piece than one to seriously hunt down for your collection, as despite some of the unique mechanics it offers, the racing is just that bit too infuriating for my liking, especially because of just how those AI rivals behave. Thankfully, that doesn't really apply to Mario Andretti's Racing, developed by Stormfront Studios and published by Electronic Arts in 1994. As a celebration of Andretti's career, you've got the option to take to the track racing sprint cars on dirt ovals, or stock cars on a mixture of ovals and road courses, along with Indy cars on road courses. Any of those can be raced as a single race or as a series which covers all the tracks for a given vehicle class. You've also got the career mode here, in which you work your way up from driving sprint cars to Indy cars by winning races and using your prize money resourcefully. When playing through one of the series modes, you'll find your prize money also allows you to upgrade your car in various ways, along with making your pit crew far more effective. Before hitting the track though, one neat feature you have is that you can take a practice run with Mario offering tips on how to handle the course. It's a minor feature all up, but it really helps those getting into racing games by showing off real techniques and how to use them to make the best time at the course. When you're ready though, it's time to qualify. This has you take a few laps and the goal being to set the best time of any of them. There are no options for car setups with this game, so getting a good spot in the grid requires you both to really know the course and how to take it well, and also make sure you can upgrade your car as much as possible to get that extra bit of speed and handling. When racing the main race itself, one thing I really appreciate is that the races are long enough to make pit stops required. Needing to watch the state of both your tyres and fuel level, and formulating the best strategy to pit and do it effectively really adds to the challenge in a unique way. But if you do it right, it can get you to the front of the pack and help secure a victory. The only real downside of this game is that there's only 5 courses across each series, making for 15 of them all up. So if you're playing that career mode, you're going to be repeating them quite a lot, which might make things a bit boring after a while. Thankfully, the AI isn't as dedicated to the idea that rubbing is racing here, as whilst they make for good rivals, they're not really interested in making things too painful for you to negotiate. Except for when they spin and manage to become a surprise hazard though. The final US-style racing title I'm looking at probably has the longest name of all of them. Newman Haas IndyCar featuring Nigel Mansell, developed by Gremlin and published by Acclaim in 1994. As the title says, this one focuses again on IndyCar racing, doing for it what its predecessor, Nigel Mansell's World Championship Racing, did for Formula 1. Options are available to race any of the 15 courses individually, or as part of a wider championship season where you'll race on each in sequence. As you'd expect, courses here are split between various types of ovals, along with road courses. Prior to running a race, you'll have the chance to practice, as well as set up your car. This process is surprisingly involved, especially if you pick the simulation mode, and well worth reading the manual to get an understanding of how you should tune the car to get the best performance for each track. Visually, when you are racing, the first thing you'll see is that this is yet another game which mixes 3D visuals for trackside objects along with sprites for the cars. The frame rate does take a bit of a hit from this approach, but honestly, I think it adds quite a bit to the game visually as a result. Despite the lower frame rate of the racing, the driving still has a good sense of feel to it, and that adds to how the game plays. The only downside is there's no attempt to simulate the banked surfaces of oval courses. I imagine it's due to limitations, but it does take something away from the thrill of racing those kind of tracks. Something else which is quite neat is that the races are short enough to allow you to get a few done in a session, but long enough that when racing you will need to actually make pit stops part of the way through. Pitting here, particularly when in simulation mode, adds a few challenges into the mix, like needing to keep to a pit speed limit or needing to take stop and go penalties. And the game is serious about you taking them, disqualifying you if you don't pit in or mess about when trying to do so. Though unsurprisingly not up to the quality of simulations which you would have gotten on a PC at the time, I found this one quite compulsive to play. The drive to master simulation mode and do a season run and take the championship really becomes a challenge that you want to work towards. All the games I've shown so far have focused on racing four-wheeled vehicles, but surprisingly, there are a few out there which focus on racing motorcycles. The first of these is Kawasaki Superbikes, developed by Longcore and published by Domark and Time Warner Interactive in 1994. What sticks out on first playing this is that it's built around the routines from Longcore's previous game, F1, with a mix of sprites used for the bikes and polygonal 3D for roadside obstacles. As with that game, the frame rate is quite solid, meaning it's quite playable when you see it in action. But for those who want a bit more power, a turbo mode is present, which scales out objects to help boost the game's performance. F1's arcade mode isn't available here, leaving you only to race a championship season from course to course. You can customise this though, allowing you to run the full season, or a subset of it, depending on your available time and mood. Racing is as you'd expect. Start out with a qualifying run to set your position on the grid, before taking to the race itself. You'll also have a chance to tweak the setup before each of those. though you don't have a large number of them on offer, really just working through your gearing, tyres and transmission type. But those are enough for tuning your bike for each race, and when done right, can seriously help you get the edge in order to take the checkered flag. Which won't be easy. Your rivals are tricky to deal with, meaning you really, and I mean really, need to learn how to corner these beasts correctly to make sure you don't lose too much speed. Mastering that is what leads you to victory in the long term. Kawasaki Superbikes could just be written off as F1 but on motorbikes, but the result makes for a unique racer in its own right. A lot of this does come from the new circuits on offer, which tend to be tighter than those that you see in F1, resulting in some seriously thrilling racing as a result. The original Road Rash certainly made a splash for many machines on its original release, but this follow-up was only released for the Mega Drive, coming out in 1992, published by Electronic Arts. This one expands the locales from the first game to feature locations across the entire US and not just in California, but you'll be racing to the same goals, aiming to place in the top 3 for each race in a given level. You'll be free to replay them as necessary, meaning that if you do miss out on a place in the first time, you can try again later with no penalty. Each new set of tracks increases the challenge from a combination of longer routes, increasingly dangerous rivals, and, yes, more traffic to avoid crashing into them. When it comes to your rivals, avoiding them is the best bet, but there are a few things you can do to be less of a target for them. Firstly, saving your prize winnings to upgrade your bike, thereby closing any performance gaps you'll have against them. Secondly, taking the fight to them. A well-timed punch, or 5, is enough to slow them down or even knock them off their bike temporarily. For some, if you time it perfectly, you'll liberate them of their weapon, letting you dish out a bit more damage as you approach the next one. The sensation of speed is certainly there, between the traffic you'll need to dodge, and not just that which you're screaming past, but also those coming from the opposite direction, and even those which are passing through at intersections. What really helps is the control scheme, responding quickly to your inputs, which is critical as you weave your way through at breakneck speed. In a way, picking which of the Road Rash games to be featured was tough. The same sense of playability and challenge is carried across with them all, but the second game feels the best of the 3, being a tightened up version of the first and with a more pleasing art style, at least to my eye. Plus, of course, having a rocking soundtrack as you race is a contribution which you cannot downplay at all. And so the checkered flag has fallen. Whilst I might not have shown every driving game or racing game released, I believe I've shown you enough of the Mega Drive's library to really show there's more than meets the eye out there. Whilst some of these titles have dated poorly, and some admittedly weren't all that great to begin with, it's important to see how they fit into the wider history, and learn what makes them work, or not, as the case may be. That being said, there are some I certainly want to spend more time with, whether it's party fare like the Micro Machines series or Super Skid Marks, games which I feel would be great for putting on when safely having visitors around is a thing again. Or games which perhaps explored avenues of racing well less travelled, as Power Drive does for rallying, or Newman Haas IndyCar does for IndyCar. There's plenty of them out there, and I plan to sit down with some of these for sure. In fact, some might even get proper videos some point in the future. Whilst watching a video or reading an article about a game is one thing, what's more important is actually playing them. And I hope this video inspires you to do that. Maybe you'll pick up a new gem or find out that what some reviewer said back in the day wasn't quite right when trying it out for yourselves. Playing the games is really what this hobby is about after all, isn't it? If you have taken the time out to revisit some, why not go to the comments and let me know what you thought. Hearing folks have discovered new favourites is one of those things I enjoy most about making these videos after all. Other than that, I just want to thank everyone for sticking with me through these first 50 episodes of Beyond the Scanlines, particularly during some of the challenges of the past year. Your support, whether direct or indirect, continues to mean a whole bunch to me. As always, if you do want to help support the show and help continue making these videos possible, do check the video description for the ways you can help do so. And with that, nothing more to say than thank you all so very much for taking the time out to enjoy this extended episode of Beyond the Scanlines.